Story Grows. I'm Bryan Patton. Today we're doing something completely different. I don't have a guest on the podcast today. Today we're talking about me and my musical journey. I thought it would be interesting in this week where I don't have an interview available to talk about how I got here, what makes me me, why certain bands are on this podcast, why I love certain genres of music, and kind of the musical evolution from young Bryan to now a man in his 40s. So I hope you're excited to learn a little bit more about me. Before we dive into my story, thanks so much for listening to this episode of As the Story Grows. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, welcome. Thanks so much for checking this out. You can find links in our show notes to our mailing list on Substack, our Discord server, and our Patreon page, where $1 a month will get you early access to every episode. If you aren't a subscriber, I would love it if you subscribe to the podcast on your podcast platform of choice. And if you'd like an As the Story Grows sticker, you can email me asthestorygrows@gmail.com, sticker in the subject line, send me your address, and I will mail you a sticker for free. All right, let's dive into this. My earliest musical memories are of country music. For some reason, when I was 7, 8, 9, country music was the genre of choice in our household. And I'm not really sure how that came to be a thing, because in talking to my dad when I was a teenager, I know he liked rock music. I know he had an affinity for early Christian rock. And my mom was not particularly a country fan. I think maybe it was an influence of my aunt, but we watched a lot of CMT and we bought a lot of country music cassette tapes via Columbia House. And so I was really into Garth Brooks. I was huge into Garth Brooks. And country music was just the genre of our house. And at some point that stopped being of interest of people or being acceptable. At some point along the way, there was a shift. And at that point in the early to mid 90s, 93, 94, 95, I think the kind of explosion of Christian music as a subculture took over the American church and kind of the influence of how parents gave things to their children. And so Christian music and Christian rock started to be a thing that was incorporated into our lives. Being in a very fundamentalist evangelical household, Christian rock was the genre we had, and I didn't know any better because I was so young. So I was listening to bands like Grandma Train and Audio Adrenaline, that first Skillet record, Bleach, and trying to just find stuff that resonated with me. So there was a show on TBN, the Trinity Broadcasting Network, called Real Videos, and they would show music videos, and it aired at midnight. It was, MTV adjacent, I guess. And one day they had this band from Orange County, California on called the Orange County Supertones, and they premiered their video for their single, Adonai. This was in the spring of 1996, and so I was 11 years old still, and I had never heard ska. I had never heard anything that quite sounded like this. The rapping on the verses, I didn't know at the time it has the great Metallica intro before the song starts. It has the horns, and as an 11-year-old, it spoke to me in a way that music up to that point had not. The Christian rock I'd been listening to had not captured my attention in a way that this song did. I think I was deeply in love with music already, and especially with music in a rock direction that would be a catalyst for me to discover things that my brain was ready for this new genre of music and this kind of new scene and subculture. So I immediately went and bought the cassette tape for Adonai. And on the back of the cassette tape, it has the record label Tooth and Nail Records. And so I started down the tooth and nail rabbit hole, as so many people did. You know, I ended up getting CDs from MXPX and Plank Eye and Starflyer 59, and just kind of starting to accrue things from Tooth and Nail. It was a sound and genre of music that spoke more deeply to me than kind of the more mainstream Christian rock stuff. The punk rock was a real eye-opening experience for me. So after Real Videos, there was a show called G-Rock, and it was snowboarding and skate videos with some music videos that focused on punk and ska and hardcore, and that became my new focus for a way to discover music. There was a label that was associated with the show called Screaming Giant Records, and they had bands like Jesse and the Rockers, Lugnut, Officer Negative, and so I liked the punk rock stuff that was happening. But through G-Rock, kind of both things simultaneously happening was the discovery of POD and their video for Selah, which was my first introduction to heavier music, and Tooth and Nail's Songs from the Penalty Box compilation.
Is a say. So go I
I did a whole podcast episode a few years back on Songs from the Penalty Box, and I will link that in the show notes. But the short answer to that is the Songs of the Penalty Box opened me up to hardcore. It had Stavesacre, which is more emo post-hardcore adjacent, especially at that time they were post-hardcore. It had Zao, it had Strongarm, it had Blindside, it had Intermeans, it had Clank. And so that was really my introduction to screaming and heavy guitars. And I was instantly drawn to that. I was a teenager starving for that. I loved it. So I immediately became a hardcore fan and bought all those early, Christian hardcore records, Focused, Overcome, Strongarm, Zao. I still have all those cassettes upstairs. And it was this thing that I loved and adored and consumed. My passion for music at that time was only growing. It was obviously not a phase, as we are here, and I'm going to be 41 years old, still talking about music, still consuming music on that sort of level. But I was the person who wanted more. I wanted to discover more. Eventually, you hit the end of the Tooth and Nail catalog, and you're like, what else is out there? At this kind of same time, I'm homeschooled, and we have satellite TV. So we had MTV, we had MTV2, we had VH1. So I was in the afternoons, my parents would go away, my mom would go away, and I would watch MTV2. And there I see Refused, New Noise. I see Deftones, Be Quiet and Drive. I see videos for Snapcase and videos for Hatebreed. And I am, because I'm obsessed with music, discovering all this music that is outside of the Christian bubble that I'm getting interested in, that I am finding ways to buy and consume. By the time I turned 16 and could drive myself to the stores, I was going to Tower Records and record and tape traders and buying CDs and records that were not Christian anymore because I wanted to know more. VH1 led me to Metallica. It led me to Megadeth. It, like, Behind the Music was so influential for discovering kind of classic bands that I was otherwise going to miss out on. And that was kind of my discovery of trying to find music that shaped me and that I enjoyed, and just kind of accruing more. I bought CDs, I bought cassettes. It was the thing I was passionate about. I loved heavy, crazy, fast music. We started going to shows. I am grateful that my dad took me to shows all the time, because at the age of 12, 13, 14, I got to go see so many bands and so many shows, because at that time there was a few venues in the area, a church that hosted bigger touring Christian acts, POD, Living Sacrifice, Staves Acre, Project 86, Squad 50, and we'd go there. There was a club northward that was a Christian club where that wasn't exclusively Christian, but they had the No Innocent Victim Agnostic Front tour that I went to and I talked about when I've talked to both NIV and Agnostic Front. There were just VFW halls that were hosting shows all the time. It was a very healthy, thriving scene back then. And you could see local bands, you could see bigger touring bands. You'd go to these VFW halls, you'd go see Shai Halud and Strongarm. Strongarm wasn't around still when I was going to shows, but like I saw Zao so many times, and Zao would just have other bands opening for them that you would discover through that process of going to shows. And everything about my life at that time was music and going to shows and discovery. It is how I spent my teenage years, learning to play guitar, going to shows, buying albums, listening to albums, reading the lyrics, looking at the liner notes, just ingesting as much of it as possible. It was instantly the thing I was obsessed with, which definitely made connection and friends hard in high school because I was obsessed with music in a way that people around me were not. People liked music. I had friends who enjoyed music. I'd go to my friend's house and we'd listen to DMX and Limp Bizkit and Korn and Jay-Z, and we would have little mosh pits in their bedroom and have fun. I had friends who would go to shows with me. I had friends who would go to Purple Door Festival with me. But nobody was consuming music at the rate I was. Nobody was interested in music in the same sort of obsessive nature that I was. And that made it difficult to talk to people and kind of have friends on that level of just like, if I met somebody who liked hardcore, then I wanted to talk to them about hardcore and all these bands and all these shows and the scene. And people were not into it the way I was. It was like, yo, bro, I like the music, but not like, it was not their all-consuming worldview, right? They wanted to talk about football or girls or other things. And I was less interested in those things. I just wanted to talk about music and go to shows. So I think a lot of people's bent is once they discover music, they keep going for the heavier and the heavier and the heavier. The thing is, metal didn't connect with me or resonate with me at that time. So like, I really liked Living Sacrifices, The Hammering Process. I liked Extol's Undeceived. I had iffy relationships with Tourniquet and Mortification. I knew they were important bands for Christian metal, but they did not really resonate with me. I wasn't into Metallica at the time. I didn't care for Megadeth so much at that time. It was not the music that drew me in. And by the time I started buying CDs and could go to shows for myself, I'm getting into Converge, I'm getting into Dillinger Escape Plan, I'm getting into Botch and Dead Guy and Coalesce. And my musical tastes are blooming and building out. And so metal didn't resonate with me. I liked hardcore. I liked maybe that early era of metalcore. The Earth Crisis is, if Converge is metalcore, so be it. All that is what I really liked. And so that became the stuff I was obsessed with. And then going into my senior year of high school, things changed. I discovered Further Seems Forever. Brett started the Juliana Theory, and I saw the Juliana Theory. There was a band called Jeremiah's Grotto that I discovered, and the word emo kind of came into my consciousness. And I was talking to a friend of mine at a youth group retreat about emo, and one of the youth leaders, Mike Garcia, Said, "Oh, you like emo?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Have you ever heard of Jimmy Eat World?" No. So he said, "All right, you're going to ride back to church with me." So we left this youth camp, went back to church. One of his friends had taken their CD of Clarity, put it on cassette tape, and he had the cassette tape. And he put Clarity in his cassette tape, and it was a transformational experience listening to Clarity in his car.
I promised I'd see it again. I promised I'd see this with you now.
Where we got back from that youth retreat, I grabbed my sister and I said, "All right, we're going to Tower Records." And I immediately bought Clarity. Jimmy Eat World became my favorite band. They've been my favorite band since that moment. And because I am obsessive compulsive, emo became my new thing. So I was using whatever search engine, however we used the internet in that time, to look up emo. And I saw Get Up Kids and The Promise Ring and Sunny Day Real Estate, Rites of Spring, Fugazi. And this was my gateway into emo and the new thing I became obsessed with. The Jinko jeans went out. The tighter Dickies came in. Chuck Taylors became a part of my wardrobe. I grew my hair long. Emo, when I was a senior in high school, was my music of choice. And this is where I kind of sat. It was transformational. At the same time, I put a lot of the heavy music behind me. And I think listening to emo kind of led me to indie rock and, emo adjacent bands. I got into Death Cab for Cutie, which led me into bands like Early Mart and Granddaddy and Longwave. And the indie rock led me to shoegaze, to My Bloody Valentine and Slowdive. And so in my late teens and early 20s, I evolved from hardcore kid to emo kid to like indie rock young adult who's, smoking Marlboro Reds and, trying to drink quote unquote good beer. Getting into shoegaze, getting into The Cure, like hardcore got into The Cure around this time, discovered the Smiths, Susie and the Banshees, just like had this musical explosion in my early 20s as I'm like, getting into democratic and liberal politics and reading different sort of books and like getting really into environmentalism and learning about beer. It was people go to college and have these like transformational experiences at colleges. I started working at the age of 19 in an audiobook studio, and through just reading different books and magazines and having interactions with people in that world changed me in the way I think college changes a lot of people. And that was my aesthetic and vibe in my early 20s. But things start to shift as I work with different people in the audiobook space, as our team grew, as different people came in from different backgrounds. And that leads me back into heavy music. But not just heavy music. So I worked for a company called Graphic Audio, and we did full audio dramatization of various audiobooks. And part of our job was dialogue editing, taking character voices and putting them into the narration. And it was kind of a boring, mundane job, but it meant you could listen to music while you did that. And so all of the engineering department would bring in hard drives and flash drives full of music and just share with each other stuff we wanted to listen to. And then we would kind of take from everybody in the pool. So one, it kind of led me to more underground hip hop and just a wider appreciation of hip hop as I discovered Madlib and Dilla, Old School Common, Talib Kweli, A Tribe Called Quest. among others. I already had a mild appreciation for hip hop, and there were records and artists I definitely enjoyed already, but this kind of expanded that into a real love of beat production and the way hip hop is crafted and created, and for the lyrical depth that you get from hip hop. And I've been a huge hip hop fan ever since, even though that doesn't always come through on the podcast. On top of that, I was starting to dive deep into post rock already. I discovered Explosions in the Sky and Mogwai and Caspian, and there was this website called The Silent Ballet, and they were like a post rock news site, and they put out these compilations every few months, and I think they did like 14 or 16. But the first ones were so influential into my love of music. And, you know, right now I have a musical project called Educated Owls, which is me finally getting to realize that post-rock dream. And post-rock is a genre I love so much. It is one of the genres I come back to so often. But kind of an extension to that is ambient music, right? So Scott Hatch from Burnt Toast Vinyl Records put out this Christmas compilation one year, and it had the song Winter Light from Hammock's Kinetic. So it had snowed, and I got stuck in the snow. My car skidded on some ice, and I got stuck kind of on a log in this ice, and I was waiting for my dad to come help me get out. And while I waited for him, I was listening to this Christmas comp. It was before Christmas, and Winter Light came on, and it struck me as so beautiful. I just had that song on repeat. I immediately got online, bought Hammock's Kinetic, and kind of started to fall in love with ambient music. The outpouring of that was a friend of mine, a coworker of mine, brought in Steve Reich's Music for 18 Musicians, and I grabbed it and put it on. And it was in that moment that I kind of realized music can be whatever the fuck you want it to be. Like, there are no boxes or parameters for what defines music. That art is art. And Music for 18 Musicians had this profound impact on me as a player. From there, I started this project called Echo Broke Alone, which became an ambient project. But at the time, I was more interested in loops and creating textures and repeating textiles with the loop station and reverb. And kind of that love with my love for Hammock and Stars of the Lid and like Brian Eno led to Echo Broke Alone, which is my other musical endeavor. And then I think the big thing out of that is just I was in a group with people who liked heavy music as well as all these other genres of music. I think one of the big things about that group of engineers in that time in my life is the music fluidity of everybody I worked with and all our varying tastes, where you could listen to R&B and hip hop and heavy metal and punk rock and emo and shoegaze and ambient and classical. And it was, how do you take all these things to inspire you to make something new and create and open up your mind? And I think that's what that time period when I was 22, 23, 24 taught me, is how am I expanding my mind musically? And that got me back into heavy music. I picked up Norma Jean's Oh God, the Aftermath, and I fell in love with Corey's vocals and absolutely adored that record. And we were just listening to a lot of Dillinger Escape Plan, and we were listening to Machine Head at the time. And there was this shared love of heavy music. And I think also out of that time frame, I had split with my high school and college era girlfriend. She went to college, I didn't. And she did not like heavy music. And I think being unencumbered from her, not that she was a burden, but I think just not having this pressure of like, okay, she's around, so I'm not listening to X music, allowed me to kind of get back into just listening to heavy music and exploring a genre I had loved and set aside for a variety of reasons. And it kind of reintroduced me to a love of heavy music. And I think this time in the story is also where heavy metal becomes a part of my life. And originally I was going to do this as a My Heavy Metal Journey podcast and decided just to make this a My Journey with Music podcast. But the first genres of metal that stuck with me, and yes, there were metal records along the way that I'd picked up and I'd enjoyed and I owned, but it wasn't until I discovered the sludge, doom, stoner genres of metal that I started to get it. Listening to the first and second EPs from Baroness and then the Red Album into bands like Kylesa and the first Tombs record, listening to Mastodon and Neuroses and discovering Isis, all of those albums and bands were so impactful to me that I loved the slow, heavy, drudgy stuff. And that resonated with me and made me a metal fan of that genre of music. Those bands are still some of my favorite bands. I mean, I remember hearing Neanderthal by Torch for the first time and being like, it was so different from anything that I had a category for music-wise as far as metal, that it was a record that blew me away. And so my real heartbeat for metal is in sludge and doom and stoner metal. I love buzzed out, slow, thick, chunky riffs. And it is a genre that I unfortunately don't get to do a lot of podcast on. I don't know why. That just genre has not come to me as much as some other genres. But that was my metal genre of choice. And those were bands and albums and a scene that I continued to pursue and accumulate. In my mid-30s, I became a black metal fan, which is the perfect time to become a black metal fan, as you are entering that phase of life when you're not supposed to discover new music, right? I think the catalyst was Death Heaven and Sunbather. I think Black Gaze was the gateway, but I think just the expansion of Bandcamp and being able to find bands based off a genre of music really helped expand my palette for what I enjoyed in the metal genre. And atmospheric black metal was a genre that worked for me. It was ambient and airy and light and had kind of that Black Gaze quality to it, while also being menacing. And by enjoying first the atmospheric black metal stuff allowed me to appreciate just old school black metal and true black metal. And there's a lot of horribly fascist and racist shit in black metal. But as a sound and a sonic palette, it became something I really resonated with, which was really weird to be. Your 30s are not your latter half of life, but what felt like a later moment for me to be discovering this new extreme genre of music that I loved. From diving into black metal gave me the kind of palette and sense to enjoy death metal and old school death metal. But ultimately, I think my love for death metal is also kind of recent because it was Lorna Shore that helped me unlock deathcore and death metal at the same time. When Lorna released the video for the first single from Pain Remains, and I can't remember, I think it was Into the Earth, I was skeptical of the video because it popped up in my YouTube feed, and I decided to watch it anyways and was absolutely blown away. I mean, just gobsmacked. And then went and saw the To the Hellfire video and was like, oh, this is a band I really like. And so I was obsessed with Pain Remains when it came out. I got to see Lorna Shore on that first Pain Remains tour, and that kind of just opened me up to deathcore, more modern deathcore, but it got me to go back to check out old school deathcore and really opened me up to that sound. And that was really my gateway into listening to more death metal and old school death metal. One of the things I've really focused on this year is there's a bunch of bands' discographies that I've never run through, that I've never spent a lot of time with, that I am revisiting, listening to Death or Testament, or just these classic bands that I have missed for a numerous amount of reasons. So that's kind of like black metal into death metal. And then I think the biggest thing to unlock a lot of my newer listening habits and my metal fandom has been this podcast, and the shift in 2020 away from nostalgia and looking backwards to being forward focused and talking to new bands. And talking to new bands has led me to go back and rediscover some old bands. It led me into power metal and symphonic metal and thrash metal and pirate metal, and really opened me up to genres of music I was closed off to before. I try to listen to every album that comes my way, no matter what genre, whether I think I would like it or I don't. The Visions of Atlantis Pirates 2 record really was this gateway record for me and symphonic metal, and going back and listening to other bands in the Napalm catalog, to listening to Nightwish, and kind of symphonic metal leads into being open to listen to power metal. And it's just fascinating how much has shifted from I did not like genres of music I did not care for, that I was not a fan of, and how much that has become so much of what I am presently listening to, and comfort listens to me. The Unleash the Archers record, Phantoma, which I picked up late last year, not when it came out. I fell in love with the record. I ended up buying the vinyl from Napalm, and it's been an album that I listen to so often because those songs are catchy. They run the gamut from heavy and fast to your ballads, and it's a wonderful record that, me of 4 or 5 years ago would not even give a chance. I would have laughed at it. But because the podcast has exposed me to so many other music genres, because I'm open to listening to bands across genres and not bringing any preconceived notions with me, it's made me a fan of bands and genres that I otherwise wouldn't be. Which leads us to 2025 and my kind of thrash metal phase. Because of all the genres, thrash metal has always been the hardest for me to get into. And when I had the opportunity to interview Warbringer this year, I listened to the single and I said, I dig it. I like it. And I said, yeah, I want to talk to the band. And I ended up downloading their entire discography. I loved that a lot. Shortly after that, I got the opportunity to interview Warfield. I've interviewed Sodom this year. I went back and downloaded Creator's discography. I got Testament's discography. I went back to the American Big Four and redove into Metallica and Slayer and Anthrax and Megadeth, and have kind of let go of whatever was holding me back from enjoying thrash metal. And so there's not a genre of metal now that I am closed off to anymore. I am just a fan of all genres of heavy music and not, being gatekeepy. This year on As the Story Grows, I have tried to focus the podcast on heavy music. I have not been extremely successful in keeping that laser focus. As we've had pop acts on this year. I'm still doing a lot of shoegaze stuff. I am trying to be open-minded to bands across genres, while keeping in mind that like heavy music is such a big umbrella, and you could talk to bands from different scenes that don't have anything to do with one another, that people who like my interview with Tom from Sodom might like my interview with Matt from Gruesome and my interview with Daniel from Arch Enemy, but they might not like Camille from Novelist or Casey from Deadlands. And so you're kind of running the gamut of what heavy music is to all different people. But, when I hear a shoegaze band that I really like, I want to talk to that shoegaze band. When I hear post-rock and post-metal bands, I want to talk to them. I talked to Sarah Gibson, which I think was a phenomenal conversation. It's dark pop music, and she has a heavy music background. It makes sense to talk to people whose music is inspiring to me and who I like. And so I have diverse tastes of music, and that shows up on the podcast. The one genre of music where we've only had one guest from is hip hop, and that was Dialect. And at some point, I tried to do more hip hop on the show, and I think, it would be interesting to talk to more hip hop artists. I think for where As the Story Grows exists, I don't think that is an avenue I'm going to chase, because I think trying to talk to bands in the metal, hardcore, post whatever world is where we're going to sit. So thanks so much for listening to this episode of As the Story Grows. I hope you enjoyed learning a bit more about me and my musical journey and why I am the way that I am. So thanks for listening.